Welcome to Let's Chew the Gum. I'm your host, Protocol. We're talking about a lot of things in this show while we chew the gum. And as always, on each and every show, we always have
something for your mind, something for your mind, something for your
무엇인가 정신을 집어넣으세요. 어떤 것 필요합니까?
something for your
정신을 집어넣으세요.
mind,
정신을 집어넣으세요.
something for your
Welcome back to the show. Today, I have a very special guest online with us to speak with us about this idea of distance learning. We've heard about it. Some of us know what it is. Many of us have never heard of it, and a lot of people are confused. Well, my guest today, who is an assistant superintendent of student services, is none other than Dr. Derek King. And he's here today to possibly address some of those questions and to provide some insight and share some experiences that hopefully will be beneficial to all of you. So let's go ahead and welcome him. Welcome, Derek, to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Doc. I'm glad to be here.
Excellent. So I wanted to start off with, before we got into the topic fully, I wanted to start off with a little bit about you and who you are. As I mentioned, you are an assistant superintendent of student services. And for those of people that are listening that are in the field of education, that may be clear of what that is, but can you describe your position to the rest of our listeners, what that entails?
Absolutely. And I would back up even further than that. So I actually transitioned into education in 1998 after transitioning out of the military, doing a program what's called Troops to Teachers. So, our military veterans who are listeners, they'll kind of understand that program a little bit easier. And so my transition from the military into education actually started in Babenhausen and Aschaffenburg, Germany, going from, being a military service person to becoming an educator through the program called Troops to Teachers. So then, just like everyone else, you kind of migrate your way through the ranks. So you start out, in my case, you start out as a teacher, then you become an administrator at whatever, level that you become an administrator at. And then you kind of keep progressing. And so an assistant superintendent basically helps to manage the principals and all, different elements in the structure of that district or that organization. In our case, the student services, what falls under me, happens to be everything related to both student services, whether that's student meals, student engagement, instruction, the educational pieces, special education, all of the departments that are outside of, in most cases, I would say finance and or the role of the superintendent and or the role of the HR. So everything else, relating to what's happening in the classroom, what's happening in professional development, what's happening in the lives of the students, fall under student services.
Got it. Well, I think that makes you the perfect guest to be on today to address some of these issues. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the COVID-19 that's going around. That's the whole reason that we're doing this mass amount of distance learning and education right now. And although this show is not about that, and my thoughts and prayers go out to everyone, please stay safe and follow the directives. I'd like to take a different lens on that. My last guest, I had asked them to give me their top 3 positives. It doesn't have to be 3, but what are some positives? We're hearing a lot of the dreary news, but there's some positive things that are happening. And so for me, and I'll say the top 3 positives from this sanctioned estrangement. How'd you like that? Sanctioned estrangement.
Oh, sure. That sounds good.
Someone said, someone's probably saying, what is that? So a government ordered social distancing. How about that? My top 3, I'll go really quick as an example, and you can chime in and give 1 or 3 if you have them. But the first one I have, it's still the same as when I had my other guests. And one of the top 3 is just really an opportunity to connect with yourself and reflect upon life's values and life in general. It's really a great time to do that. My number 2 is the opportunity for me, at least, to be creative late night. I'm a late night creative, and being that I'm distanced from everyone and not necessarily having the same schedule, it's given me some opportunities to really, again, reflect, and then also to be creative in how I can manifest those reflections. And then finally, I absolutely love what I've been hearing about the return of natural habitats. And as I was thinking of that, I believe I saw you make a post about that. That may be where I first saw that from. But the idea of deer returning to Japan streets and the dolphins in the Venice Canal, et cetera, et cetera. So those are my top three. Do you have any positives that you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to kind of interweave three things, one of which is work related or it's at least in our field related. So I would say one of the top three, byproducts of this social distancing happens in my case would be our parents are going to have a better understanding and appreciation for our educators and what they kind of go through. Because like you were talking about, when you're looking at social media, you're seeing a lot of memes, but those memes are rooted in reality, people's frustration with not understanding what it takes to help a student learn, right? And so a lot of times prior to this, and this is the first time this happened in all of our lifetimes, where we've had a mandated quarantine, quote unquote, where we're all at home and everyone's family is at home and they can't get anywhere else. And right. They're responsible for at least taking a more amplified position in helping their child learn. Prior to this, there was a tendency a lot of times to not believe and or respect or appreciate the educator. It's not my baby's fault. You just don't understand. You're just not a good teacher. You don't take time to listen. Now you're starting to, people are going to have a better understanding of just everything that it takes, because what we all understand as educators is without regard for how a child comes to us, we give it our absolute best to help the child go from A to Z, based on their own particular learning modalities, based on their own tendencies, based on, whatever they come to us, whatever needs they have. We actually do our absolute best to fill those needs, engage that student and help them learn. I would say that's one for me. Okay. Number two for me, I would say also is somewhat related to education, but I would bring this back to just myself and for us as individuals. It gives us an opportunity to just be still and be quiet, right? And give us an opportunity to just look around and enjoy those simple things. Now we're not always filling our day with, I need to go to the movies or I need to do this or that or the other thing. Now families have more of an opportunity to be at that kitchen table, to have those discussions, because I truly believe, that a lot of our problems in our society will be resolved based on that kitchen table solution, right? Absolutely. Just reaching out to those kids, having those relationships, strengthen those relationships. You know what they did all day, but now you can ask the question, what do you think went great about today? How do you think tomorrow can be a little bit better than today? Or just have conversations that aren't rooted in anything specific, but let the child guide, what's happening in those conversations. So I think, number two, that will be my number two.
How about that?
And then for me, number three, hopefully we don't just go right back to everything becoming so consumer oriented, right? And what I mean by that is, now that we're at home, we, at least me, I spent the other day just sitting out looking at my fish, sitting by, I happen to have a fire table or whatever. It doesn't cost me anything to turn that fire table on. And I just sat there and I just listened to music. And I did that for like 2.5 hours. And it was absolutely great. And I really appreciated doing that, So that would be my third.
Absolutely. No, man, those are great. And I think that it would be a shame if things just went back to the way they were. And I have a suspicion that they won't in a lot of ways. And I hope in a lot of positive ways. No, that's great, man. So I appreciate that, because people need to hear that positive side. We definitely need balance. We know the realities, but we definitely need balance. Well, okay, man. So let's absolutely. Yes, indeed. So let's get into the reason that we are here and the reason that people are listening. I'd like to think they enjoyed our top three also. So with this distance learning, I know many of us have been distance education, I should say, because there's the teaching component as well as the learning component. And I know a lot of us have done this for years, and some people have never done it. And there's just a lot of, you can almost feel the angst when you're looking on social media sites from some people. And in turn, I've seen there are several LEAs or school districts that have been as revealing as they can be at the time, because they're receiving directives and there's a lot of logistics that go with it, but it's leaving some people without sufficient answers or ideas. So if we can just talk about that. So I guess my first, not really question, but thought that I would pose to you is, how are teachers in a distance learning format going to, or how should they attempt to keep students engaged? Again, you spoke about the learning modalities, right? So what does that look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me back up and say, so I have worked for Excelsior Charter Schools. We've been around for 25 years. We've always been a hybrid of independent study and traditional seat time, like meaning our kids go to class, but also there's a lot of distance learning that's involved. Now, the reason why I use the term independent study is just because that's how it's identified in the California Department of Education. But the reality is exactly what you mentioned, using the term distance learning. I use the term distance learning and distance education interchangeably, but the learning is actually more appropriate, because we know, like, sometimes connotatively when we're talking about education or we're talking about teaching, we're talking about delivery, right? But when we're talking about learning, we're talking about reception and being able to achieve a certain level of mastery based on the information, or being able to synthesize that information.
Right.
So in our case, we were actually very, very prepared to transition from our existing model to this current state where now we are 100% distance learning. And that's being done in a variety of different ways. So basically, we use different platforms to be able to reach out to our students, whether that's done by video or whether it's done telephonically, to be able to have both synchronous, meaning real-time live conversations with the classrooms, individual students as well as groups of students, as well as asynchronously, meaning information is there and readily available for students to acquire, digest on their own time, submit the work, and receive feedback from the teachers.
Sure. Assignments or pre-recorded lessons, pre-recorded lectures, videos, things that are prepared already that they can access asynchronously. Correct. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. Some of it is already prepared. Some of it is curriculum that we already had developed a long time ago. So to address all the different learning modalities, we always had it to where we're always going to increase the amount of instructional time. Meaning, if you provided instruction in a classroom, but then you found something that would enrich that lesson, we would put it in our systems. Like in our case, happens to be Canvas, which allows teachers to collaborate, parents to collaborate, students to collaborate. That's both real time and asynchronously. Like, meaning we can all log in and have those conversations, whether that's via video, whether it's via telephone, or any combination of those two, and have discussions on the student's performance to include the student, as well as information and instruction that's already there. The student can submit their assignments. In our case right now for distance learning, we have prescribed times, just like a master schedule.
Right.
We have those master schedules for those instructional times, meaning 7th grade English is happening at this time with this teacher and this time with this other teacher, and 8th grade, and physics is happening at this time in biology, and so on and so on.
Well, I mentioned that we would take some online questions during this interview, and your last statement, the question that is being asked fits perfectly. So this is from, happens to be a teacher from the high desert, San Bernardino County. For you guys that aren't here, that's Southern California, San Bernardino County, the largest county in the United States. So this teacher asked, well, you're welcome. She says, thank you for the clarifying emails and resources. I'm not sure which teacher this is, but you're welcome. The question she asked is, how are we supposed to monitor our own children's education at home while conducting our lessons simultaneously. What is this supposed to look like? I imagine she is a teacher. She has her own children. I guess she has to monitor with their distance education. So how are they to, what does that look like for her or for teachers in that situation?
Right. So we're very mindful that this crisis, that our teachers are people, right? That they're going through this crisis just like everyone else. So let me kind of back up and provide a little bit more clarity. One of the things that we made sure to do in this particular circumstance is pay everyone, whether that's support staff, no matter if they were there or not. But what we also did was, just like our typical daily requirement is 8 to 4. So what we asked is to be available from 8 to 4 for certain staff members, to say if they're the ones answering the phones or whatever, whatnot. But our educators, like I mentioned regarding the master schedule, they have a lot more control because they were the ones who actually worked with their site leadership to develop that master schedule to say, I can teach this class at this time, this class at this time, or whatever, whatnot. So that way they're not overwhelmed. So we don't have any educator right now that is teaching more than 3 blocks. And those blocks don't have to be an hour-long block. It could be 20 minutes. It could be, 35 minutes. It's up to that particular educator.
Well, that's great. So they have points of access and it's flexible. And I think that allows a lot for them to differentiate and provide accommodations, because I would imagine, being a teacher myself, I would imagine that if it was a 20-minute set, perhaps they'd have a different time frame where they may address questions or concerns that students have. So no, I love that flexibility. And it sounds like that model accommodates and differentiates, has those components built in for the students that you serve. That's great. So,
absolutely. And if I can just add to that.
Go ahead.
So what happens is that session is happening live. So our platform allows our students to be able to log in from home, our teachers to be able to log in from home. Now, we did set out guidelines or whatever for proper internet etiquette. Those are very, very intentional regarding, what's in the background, what the person's wearing, what the student, we send it home to our families and stuff like that also, as well as outside of those timeframes, to your point, students could submit questions. Now, they can also ask those questions live. The byproduct of actually us doing it this way, what we found is students desire to have that social interaction. So we're constantly tracking our data to see, our student engagement through this time. As I mentioned, we use a few different platforms. So now in our platforms, we can both track the amount of time that students are on, as well as the number of clicks through the different instruction. And so what we've actually found, Dr. K, is it's actually increased. So, for example, we're at about a 35% increase in our students' online participation, which actually makes sense because it's our only modality right now.
Sure. No, absolutely. It makes sense. You landed right into another concern that I have or that I've thought about is how are districts going to ensure the safety of teachers' privacy as well as that of the students and safety, because they'll be embarking upon, cross communication via not only personal home devices or at least personal home networks. And those are so many access points. So how do we ensure, and you touched upon it with saying, making sure what you wear, what's in the background, et cetera. How should districts approach that or where teachers are comfortable who haven't done this before?
Right. Well, you have to, one, have the training. You have to have another very strong acceptable use policy. That's between both the students' acceptable use policy as well as the teachers' acceptable use policy. Because what we need to be very, very careful is you don't want, quote unquote, improper interaction between students and or teachers either. Right?
Sure.
I mean, not indicting any person, but we all watch the news. Those things happen.
Absolutely.
Right? So on our devices, on our platform, there's no expectation of privacy in that particular interaction.
That's how it should be expected,
but,
yes.
Absolutely. So our expectation is that if you are interacting with a student, there's, on our platforms, there is nothing that we should not be able to inspect at all. The second piece to that is just like every acceptable use policy, every, piece that's in an employee handbook is the proper interaction between students and teachers, right? So then that way we understand, and in our case, because the instruction it's actually recorded every time too. So for families who maybe can't make it during that particular instructional block, they can always go back and look at it. We're also archiving the information because, again, it allows students to be able to increase the instructional time. It also allows us to get better as an organization because, say, absent this particular circumstance, right, and the student were on home hospital or something like that happened, they can always go back and review if they needed to. So that's an unusual byproduct, but it's actually making us better as a cohort of educators because now we're having a better understanding of having to shut off all face-to-face interaction and just have it either synchronously or asynchronously, but through the usage of technology.
Yeah, that's a great point because we do have the home hospital model or independent study where, you know, we're providing lessons for students who are already at home. So that's a social distancing on a small scale. And, you know, I've received a lot of emails from educators talking about what is this going to look like? Oh, my God, we have to do this social distancing. And my response was, and maybe it was ignorant of me, but I really kind of thought that we were all as educators doing some form of distance learning, but I can understand when it transforms to, you know, you're used to your classroom and your board and your classroom gadgets and seating arrangements. So I can definitely understand where people may have some concerns about that. So in any situation when it comes to education, when it comes to students being graded and assessed, we want to make sure that there's some accountability. And, you know, in class, when you have a face-to-face, if assessments are done in class, if you aren't doing some more contemporary current models of educating, meaning anything outside of didactic learning, how do you ensure that students are accountable? For example, how do we know the work is being done by the students? How do we know, right?
Yeah, I think the same elements that we actually have when we send home homework still exist. They may be somewhat amplified in this particular environment, but they still exist. Like, how do we know that student A is doing the homework and their brother, sister, girlfriend, mom, dad, or whomever is not the one actually completing the work, right? We usually figure that out in some form of assessment. But what we decided, because we knew this piece was going to come up too, and again, this is still, you know, a process that is developing. But what we decided to do is both show grace as well as assume good intent, meaning we're operating our assessments the same way we would an open book test, right? You still have a high level of rigor, and we still have the questions and everything there, understanding that if we were to ask parents to proctor the test and not in any way indicting anyone, you're going to have certain parents who do proctor the test. You're going to have other families who may not proctor the test. And morally, that would injure the kid or disenfranchise or disadvantage the child who had the proctored test versus the one who was in a household who mom just says, well, just get it done.
Sure.
Right. And they got it done. So what we've done in that case is just make sure we include a high level of rigor, which, you know, would require the students to participate. But also the checking for understanding happens in our synchronous model, because remember, the students are still attending via those online instructions.
It's not a free for all.
So
right.
No, it's not free for all. No. And let me back up and make another differentiation. I started out by mentioning that the California Department of Education identifies certain organizations as independent study, but it would actually be a little bit more appropriate to be identified as distance learning or distance education, at least in our case, because there's not a lot of independence, meaning you have an opportunity to be supported. So I always had identified us specifically as a supported independent study simply because the funding model under the California Department of Education only sees it one or two ways, either traditional or independent study.
Right. Absolutely makes sense. Tori, we have an online question. Tori, I imagine she's a senior in high school. Okay. The question is related to valedictorian. That's something that's different, as final grades were due to be coming out at the end of the year, and there's some calculations. Mm-hmm. Her concern is for valedictorian, sometimes they're so competitive. She's wondering how would they ensure that it's not unfairly awarded, meaning that students actually are working to get the grade that they want to achieve versus somehow not necessarily scamming the system, I would imagine is what she's meaning. But how do we ensure that?
Sure.
And I know you spoke about your model. And before you answer Tori's question, let me just address your last point of the academic rigor and the levels of understanding that are going into your interactions. I think that was a great answer, and I think is appropriate for the education model that all schools should follow, or all teachers, because the assessments are important, but I'm really into the process and the academic rigor that it entails getting to that point. The assessment definitely is important, but what is the process? So I'm really into the process that's happening. The product is great, but the process. And so again, I love the way you answered that. But let's address Terry's.
And thank you for that too.
Sure.
Go ahead. Thank you for that. I want to add to that because I appreciate you grabbing to that, because that's incredibly important. Sometimes we just look at it. If you look at an assessment is an autopsy, basically, right? And I hate to use that connotatively, but it is, in the sense that this is what you know based on everything else. But as educators, we always have to stay both fluid, innovative, creative, to understand that there's different ways to demonstrate mastery.
Absolutely.
And so depending on the instrument that you're using to create that assessment, or the instrument that the assessment actually becomes, one student might do better than another. But the reality that as an educator, we have opportunities to be able to say that sometimes a student might be able to demonstrate their higher level of mastery if you give them a different means to be able to do it.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you said that. I've always held that philosophy, and individuals would look at me sideways sometimes because, what do you mean you're not giving a paper test? I said, no, well, this student's going to come in at lunch and we're going to have a conversation. Well, this student's going to do a newscast. This student's going to do a newspaper report and create this student's going to go out in the field and interview and come back. There's so many ways that looks like. And I think it lowers the effective filter of students if from day one they understand that you will be able to demonstrate your mastery in a myriad of ways. I know in my classroom, I'll have success criteria of what it means to be successful in meeting this objective. But then I leave a space for students to say, hey, I'd like to show my mastery in this way. So it's very open to students to say, this is what I can do and what I can produce. And I think that's great, especially when we have a multiplicity of students ethnically with various levels of academic abilities, insights, whatever. There's a multiplicity of things we need to consider. So why not have a multiplicity of ways that students can demonstrate mastery? Very, very good.
If I can back up and relate something to this, because the conversation I constantly have, and it's actually something I wrote down, and I don't know if I'm going to pursue it in a book or not, but that sentiment is captured in this idea that I've always had, like, why do rappers who, can use double and triple entendres and sophisticated metaphors, why would they ever fail math? Why would they ever fail English?
Right.
Because they're proving a mastery of the usage of the English language, right? So some of that is just an engagement piece. Some of it is, I just don't want to demonstrate my higher level of mastery in a certain way. And how I came to that mindset is I think about the number of highly successful rappers who are very lyrical, but they dropped out of school.
How about that?
Right? They're clearly demonstrating that they have the intrinsic ability to both synthesize information, meaning taking information from different parts and put those things together. They're also demonstrating, again, their ability to utilize the English language at a level that is higher than most. But yet and still, if not done right, what happens a lot of times is their academic grade, because they weren't engaged or didn't have the opportunity to be able to demonstrate their level of skill in another manner other than a paper test, they become disengaged. Absolutely. And we can do better than that.
Absolutely. And we have to. Definitely we have to. That was an excellent point. So man, we could go on that topic for quite a while. I'm definitely understanding where you're coming from and what you're meaning, and providing access points and teachers being creative and innovative in the way they do that. And I think that would go a long way to alleviate this dropout rate that we have, that includes some of the rappers that you didn't specify, but that would include that particular population. Many of them are forced out because and it's not that they can't see a way, it's that they haven't been shown that their way is valid. And so they lose the connection. Well, Tori had the question. How will they ensure that grades are awarded fairly when it comes to things such as valedictorian? You want to address that?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, the perception of the teacher is embedded in every single grade. So in very few, if not, there might not be any instances, the students who are competing for the top percentile, valedictorian, salutatorian, they in very few cases have an identical transcript, meaning they had all of the same teachers. They might have some of the same teachers. They might have a lot of the same teachers, but they in very few cases will they have all of the same teacher. So there's always going to be some element in there, and some of that is going to be related to trust, right? We trust that our teacher corps are grading at a high level. We're trusting a higher level of rigor that's being instituted. Now, in this case, because we're now talking about second semester grades, if I were to address Tori's question, we're talking about second semester grades because everyone was there for the first semester.
Right.
So it was just done in the traditional manner. So within the second semester, there should not be some great inflation of performance that could not be verified. Now, in our case, students are still submitting the work. Right? So it's not as if you take a student who was totally disengaged and, well, we're talking about the top few students in this case. So to answer Tori's question, some of those things are still going to be there. But again, with assessments being rigorous, some of that competition, I would just suggest to Tori and every other student who's pushing for valedictorian or salutatorian or top 1% or top 5% to keep trying their absolute best. Hopefully that other students they're competing with, that other student, I'm going to assume good intent, is also doing the same. Now, the reality is whether or not they achieve that top level, they're going to get better simply by academically competing. So I'm very proud of Tori, whether I don't know if Tori's male or female, but I'm very proud of that student for asking that question. But within there, I would say it's going to the same exact experience that you would have in the classroom, we're still going to have now.
Absolutely.
We're hoping that our teachers, still hold themselves to a high standard, that we still keep our expectations high, and that we don't water down our education, because no one wins there.
Okay, Dr. King, I'm going to take a quick second for a break for our sponsors. To our audience, you are listening to Let's Chew the Gum, the podcast where we talk about everything from A to Z, and where we oftentimes chew gum like I'm doing now. Who says you can't chew gum and talk? I think it gives you a great rhythm and motivation to keep going. If you are enjoying the show, no matter what platform you're listening to now, we are also available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Breaker, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, RadioPublic, Spreaker, and of course, YouTube. Tune in usually Tuesdays and Friday nights, and we will see how that goes. Feel free to call in with show topics or topics you want to have discussions about yourself. We'll be right back.
Something for your mind.
Please smile again.
Something for your mind.
If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Something for your mind.
Thank you for listening to our sponsor, and we hope you enjoyed that break. We're back here on Let's Chew the Gum with our special guest, Dr. Derek King, Assistant Superintendent of Student Services for Excelsior Charter Schools. Am I saying that correctly, Dr. King?
Absolutely. You got it perfect.
Great. So we're going to continue our discussion on the topic of distance education and all that entails. When we left off, we were having a great discussion about the validity of distance learning education, addressing the various modalities of learning and reliability. And we had an online question from Tori from Oklahoma that Dr. King addressed in an eloquent way regarding valedictorian and making sure that that's assessed fairly for those students that have worked hard. I wanted to talk now, Dr. King, about access. We may have touched upon it briefly, but access in terms of students who are in locations where they maybe not have internet access, where situations where students may not be able to afford internet access. Or, for example, in my area, the internet access is so bad that if you don't have a particular plan, you won't receive a signal because there's radio towers. So we have all those types of situations. Sure. And then we have to also look at students that don't have maybe Chromebooks. I know a lot of districts provide those, but some don't. So we have a lot of, and I've mentioned students, but also for the educators. We may assume they have internet access or sufficient bandwidth, et cetera. So let's talk about that and what that might look like in this situation.
So in our case, understanding that, so we try to ask ourselves the hard questions ahead of time, because we really believe if something can't survive a conversation, can't survive execution. Right. So we actually did a good job of understanding which ones of our families did not have internet access before we actually had to leave. Right. So we clearly understood down to the student who did not have internet access. Now, all of our students happen to already have one-to-one devices. So they either have a Chromebook and or an iPad. But what we needed to do in those cases, if the student did not have internet access, thankfully, there was two organizations that actually stepped up. So I want to publicly say thank you to both Comcast and Spectrum. So for any K-12 student that did not have access to the internet right now during this time of the 24-hour stay-home order, they can actually receive it for free. And we actually used our IT staff to be able to walk those families through getting signed up for that. Now, in some cases, though, you have families where, to your point, it was spotty in those areas, or maybe there wasn't coverage there. And so in our case, what we did was we actually allowed them to sign out 3G iPads, meaning iPads that already had internet embedded in them. Now, as it relates to our staff, that same step was actually taken. Even our staff members, the ones who, like I mentioned before, we have some people who are answering the phone from 8 to 4, where they're not answering their own personal phones because the phone is being forwarded to a number. Well, we actually went out and bought more cell phones and issued those out to the staff members. That way, because otherwise you would have people, once they receive that person's number, they'll be calling you at 7 and 8 o'clock at night. Remember,
absolutely.
Educators are people too. We have families too. You have to be able to cut it on and cut it off. And so we're very, very mindful of that. So the equity and access piece always matters. But specifically when you're talking about distance learning, because there needs to be technology involved in the process. So any LEA that decides to take these steps, we have to be mindful and ready to be able to fill in those deficits.
Absolutely. Well put. That is definitely a concern I hear, even prior to the distance learning situation we're in now, where some students have not had access, etc. You know, my next thought when I'm hearing that, and it's an appropriate answer. My next thought is, what about schools that don't have that funding to go out and purchase those items for their students? Schools that don't receive the funding or don't have the sponsorships or the parent groups that fundraise. How are we looking at that?
So I would give this advice. There's a ton of grants that are always available for these types of things. Even after we went out on the stay order, there's a few emergency grants that are actually available too. And so just like anything else, you have to get good at being able to tell your story, right? But telling your story through the use of data, being able to clearly explain why you have this particular need for data, identifying your student populations, whether that was done through socioeconomically, and you can easily use your free and reduced matrix. You can actually use individual families. You can use whatever it is you actually need to use. There's a lot of funds that are out there and available to be able to purchase certain items or purchase those things for those families to be able to instruct them via distance.
That's great.
And the other piece I would say to that, though, is we all, have local control accountability plans, right? So within that local control accountability plan, we should be identifying special populations and those needs for those populations to close that academic performance gap, right?
Absolutely.
Now, if that academic performance gap could exist because there is a deficit in instructional supports, right? That instructional support could be a device. So LEAs, school districts, schools need to identify year over year. When you look at a budget, the best way I can answer it this way is when you look at a budget, you can tell what your priorities are. Are your priorities the students?
Absolutely.
Or are your priorities something else, right? If there's nothing in that budget to be able to address those deficits, that means you are clearly saying those deficits are not as important as you might state.
Well put.
Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. That's why I'm always telling parent groups or individuals in the community that I come across that it's imperative that they attend their local control funding formula meetings when they're talking about the local control funding of the plan. They need to attend. Mm-hmm. They need to be there represented. Yeah. They need to make their voices and their needs heard. And oftentimes, if individuals aren't out there, as you said, doing a good job of telling their story and their needs, right, sometimes it's assumed that it's not needed. I think it'd be an oversight on anyone in leadership to not know that's a need, and we shouldn't have to have parents that need to come out and say that. But sometimes it needs to be emphasized because you can't assume that the individuals making those decisions, that again, that's a priority to them, right? We learned early on that, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil, right? So you have to speak up and be present in those situations. It's much like the importance of filling out the census, and we could go on a whole show about that as well.
Absolutely.
That'll be a different show. We'll do a show on the importance of the census next time.
Absolutely.
No, that's great. So along with the access point, and I'm not sure if this is going to change or how this may change. I know there's a lot of discussion between labor unions and management in some instances, or just individuals, legislators, etc., about if there needs to be a restructured or an additional compensation model for educators that may not have internet access. Right. I do know some educators that don't at home. I know some that don't have technology at home at all, and that's the way they choose. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But in this situation where they may have to, will they be compensated if they have to acquire or to pay for those services? I know you spoke that Comcast and another company
and Charter Spectrum
have provided, and I don't know if they're providing that for educators as well. And if not, again, does there need to be a compensation model that considers that, or if teachers have the capabilities, but they don't have enough speed at home to accommodate the demands that's going to put on their network?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we always need to consider, going back to an educator as a person, right? We should never, and even though this is part of all of our lives, buying things for our classrooms and stuff like that, but we should never harm a teacher in order for them to be able to do their job, right? And what I mean by that is whether that compensation, to be able to fill in that deficit for now, I'm requiring you to have internet access in order to be able to deliver instruction. So I'm the one creating that bill at your house. So I need to be able to resolve it in some manner. If you can't resolve it that way, you can always resolve it by providing them a device that has an embedded internet that the LEA is actually paying for. But one way or the other, no matter how it's done, whether it's done between the labor unions, or whether it's done via reimbursement, some type of compensation, whatnot, it should be done. Because if we're saying that in order for you to do your job, and you weren't hired that way, but now we're requiring that of you, we should then be the ones filling in the gap. We should not be creating a fiscal deficit at your house. Because if you didn't have the internet before and now you have to have it because of something outside of your control, and it's required for us to be able to deliver instruction and support to our students, the LEA should be the one footing that bill.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to say also, you brought up the point that, as educators, we're always buying supplies for our classrooms and things that we need. And that's true. And I just want to say how proud I am of the teachers that I'm seeing, not only in California where we are, but across the nation, that are stepping up to offer services really for free to their students. They're out of the goodness of their heart. Yes. They're recognizing the situations that families are in. So whether they're providing resources or services where they're tutoring online, or they're, directing them to proper locations, right? I know that I've seen this since the quarantine began, that teachers are really stepping up. And so, but if teachers need the compensation, it's something that's required, that should be. So thank you to all the teachers and educators and everyone in general that's really stepping up, altruistically with a good heart to help out our neighbors, right? I'm a firm believer.
And along those lines,
go ahead.
Yeah. And along those lines, I want to, just go ahead and dovetail that with, we also owe a debt of gratitude to the students from Harvard, MIT, UC Berkeley, because they're giving free tutoring to K-12 students across the country right now.
How about that?
Logging in, whether that's math, English, whatever it is, they're giving free tutoring right now.
That's excellent. Go ahead and repeat that again so our listeners can hear where they can receive that free tutoring.
So if they go to medium.com, medium.com, the students from Harvard, MIT, and UC Berkeley are giving free tutoring to K-12 students.
That's outstanding. Medium.com. That's outstanding.
Yep.
No, we definitely need that. There's so many aspects of this distance learning that we could cover, and we've covered quite a bit. I wish we were live during the after spring break. Maybe we will be, to just see how this pans out and what further questions and concerns that it brings up. I'm not sure that I have any other questions, man. You've been so great in answering and offering and adding useful bits of information that I feel, and I felt equipped already, but I feel that for our listeners who weren't, you've done a great thing in providing them some insights and maybe a little bit of calming the nerves and providing some directions, and that's great. Are there any other concerns or supports or thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners?
I'd just like to echo your last thought, and that is, you're always going to crawl and then walk and then run. This is new to us all. It's a crisis. Everyone has anxiety over the crisis, and just take baby steps. We'll all get there, right? As long as we're taking the steps, and really not forgetting the obstacles that we had through this crisis. That way we become better as educators on the other side of it. Parents become better as academic advocates for their kids after we get on the other side of it. Our relationships with our families, the parent-teacher relationship, should be greatly improved, because the teachers should be more appreciated than we currently are right now. So I appreciate you having this platform to be able to have this discussion, because this discussion is necessary. Specifically, the pieces about advocating for yourself, getting in there and being in those local control accountability plan meetings, understanding the local control funding formula, understanding that at its core, at its premise, the local control is about understanding what your particular needs are and allocating your funding as such. So get in there, ask those questions. If you don't have those devices and everything right now, make sure you're advocating for those things, at those next meetings. Make sure you're advocating for those things from now in perpetuity. Make sure you understand where your district, where your school, or anyone actually stands, not only for you and your child, but also how does it support the educator, to your other underlying point, that funds are allocated for that too.
Absolutely well put. Let me just explain, because I know that we have listeners from around the world, actually. So when we're talking about our LCFF, that's in the state of California. The LCFF is the local control funding formula, and that's the mechanism by which schools are funded throughout the state. And when we talk about the LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan, that is the plan that each district is required, or each educational LEA is required to come up with, that meets the requirements of the funding formula for their various students and their population needs, right? So based upon those meetings, that's how funds are allocated. And as Dr. King alluded to, or didn't allude to, you flat out said it, that you can look at a budget, and right from the budget, you can tell what the priorities are. Make sure that your priorities become a part of your LEA's budget. Okay. Well, we've just about come to the end of this segment, or this episode. I'd like to ask you. You mentioned during the interview, you talked about a book coming out. Is that something that we can talk about here?
Well, I talked about, and you know this, a lot of us, we toil with the idea of writing certain books. So to be 100% honest, I probably have about 4 or 5 ideas floating out there, with partially written things.
Sure.
But the underlying idea of how do we reach students where they are, and how do we make sure that we embed creativity in instruction, we embed creativity in being able to demonstrate mastery, that really matters. Because in the real world, we don't always receive high stakes. We're allowed to synthesize information and use that information to our benefit, like we just talked about. So one of the rappers I was actually alluding to, being a high school dropout, is now a billionaire, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Jay-Z is now a billionaire. But again, if you listen to them, they have a skill set that I don't have. Again, sophisticated metaphors, double and triple entendres. They have a mastery of the English language. But check the transcripts.
Right.
A lot of them probably speak English, right? But embedded within them is not only the ability to pass English, it's to excel in it. And they demonstrated that in another way.
Through synthesis, application, and beyond. I love it, man. I love it. Okay. Last opportunity, not really an opportunity, because the opportunity was mine to have, such an informed guest on the show. And so I really appreciate you agreeing to come on and have this discussion. I do want to ask, on a professional, outside of your career, are there any professional services that you offer or that you can recommend to our listeners, whether it's related to education or just for the betterment of themselves?
None that I specifically offer, but here's what I would offer the listeners. What I would offer them is, just like we typically get coaches for our students in athletic endeavors, do the exact same in academic endeavors, because our mind is also a muscle. As we increase the level of rigor, your kids will get smarter and smarter and smarter, and that will benefit them. Because if I could leave you with one thing, it would be, understand that just like on the field, just like on the court, in life, we are competing. So the stronger your child is, the better they'll have it.
Oh, I couldn't have said it better myself, and I won't try to. With that, I'm going to leave it there. You've been listening to Let's Chew the Gum, the podcast where we talk about everything from A to Z. Our guest today has been Dr. Derek King, Assistant Superintendent of Student Services for Excelsior Charter Schools. And we thank him so much for imparting this knowledge on us today. And Dr. King, we may ask you to come back. This is going so well. So if you'd oblige us,
it'd be my pleasure.
We appreciate that. So you guys, thank you again. This has been Let's Chew the Gum. You can email us at letschewthegum@gmail.com or at protocol.com. That's PROTKALL@gmail.com. We can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. We're out there for you. So submit your ideas. And as always, we always have
Something for your mind. Something for your mind. Something for your mind.
정신을 집어넣으세요. 어떤 것 필요합니까?
Something for your
정신을 집어넣으세요.
mind.